Thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here, Paul.
So, what is public diplomacy?
Public diplomacy is about communicating with foreign publics for the purpose of achieving a foreign policy objective.
And what are the kinds of things the United States government does in public diplomacy?
We do quite a few different things. It includes programs for advocacy, international broadcasting, listening to foreign publics to find out what their opinions are and incorporate that into our process of policy making. We have international exchange programs, things like that. And also psychological warfare is actually considered one of the main pillars as well.
You've recently written a substantial report on public diplomacy. What did you find were the major challenges the United States faces?
Well, in modern times, there's a few challenges that we face. Since the end of the Cold War, we haven't really had much of a strategic direction. There hasn't really been sort of a behemoth of an overarching enemy that we've really been able to organize ourselves against. And that's not to say that public diplomacy is supposed to necessarily be against something, because it's always better in general to be for something. But we find that today, with modern communication technologies and the general information overload that's out there, we have issues with keeping people's attention spans, crafting messages that resonate with them. There's a few other issues as well. Limited time. People have very limited time nowadays, and they've got so much information in front of them, so many news sources that they're checking, so much feedback from their friends and social media and that stuff, that it's a matter of getting a message out there that people even want to pay attention to begin with.
You discussed in your report a lot about the latest efforts that the United States government is doing in social media terms. How do we know that's being effective?
Well, we don't. I mean, social media is still a relatively new thing. It's only been prominent for about the last 10 years, and that's right around the time where we decided that we needed to put a whole lot more effort into public diplomacy. I think part of the issues that we run into is that in the United States we're so accustomed to social media and we understand how it can be effective domestically, and we sort of misinterpret it and assume that it can be effective overseas. And yes, in some cases that's possible. Works relatively well in places like Europe, parts of Asia where people are very connected. But when you get into some of the more troublesome areas we have, parts of South Asia, Afghanistan, even certain segments of the Middle East, even though there are certain people who are connected on social media and it's played a role in some of these countries, it's much more difficult to reach some of these populations that are disconnected from that don't even use the internet on a regular basis, or that aren't even able to use social media, because doing so would endanger their safety.
And as we approach the election, let's look back on the Obama administration. What's been their strategy in public diplomacy?
Well, when Obama was campaigning originally, he came out pretty strong with some good, fairly good public diplomacy principles. He wanted to reconnect with foreign publics, strengthen our general diplomacy overall, approach our problems from a more multilateral perspective. And that had a lot of effects in areas like Western Europe, where we had alienated some of our allies at one point with some of our previous policies. So he made quite a bit of improvement there, and some diplomats have reflected that it's generally easier to operate when you have somebody that you like a little bit more. But there's also been some other issues. Some of the rhetoric hasn't really been followed up with action. Primary example is the Cairo speech that he made in 2009, where his first major overall public speech was made in Egypt to the Arab world to basically start a new beginning with Muslim populations. And although it was sort of received well in the beginning, there were some concerns that he wasn't going to follow through on some things, and that's basically what happened. Some of the major promises that were in that, things like the Abu Ghraib policy, following through on finding an end, and he meant personally, basically finding an end to the Arab-Israeli conflict, they weren't really followed through on, and that really resonated more than the things he actually accomplished with the speech.
Matthew, do you think this is a symptom of not necessarily the lack of follow-through, but the issue of overpromising?
I think that has a lot to do with it. It's generally a good practice in public diplomacy to not promise what you can't follow through on or can't provide in the end. If you go and trying to establish something and you make a promise, it's very important to follow through on that and to analyze if you can do that in the first place. One example of this is the Guantanamo Bay situation, which Obama talked about in the Cairo speech in 2009, where he promised that we would close Guantanamo Bay and find an alternative solution for dealing with detainees. Unfortunately, that wasn't really under his control. There was a lot of domestic opposition to that, and it was very difficult to find a solution. To this day, that hasn't been followed through on. And again, not necessarily something he had complete control over.
And that is very clearly linked with some other pillars of national security. in aid, development, military issues of overpromising?
Absolutely, and I think one of the primary examples we have of this is the continued tendency we have to promise new Marshall Plans for countries. We've talked about Marshall Plans for Iraq, Marshall Plans for Afghanistan, Marshall Plans for countries affected by disasters. And I think that's really setting the bar too high for the way the world works. The Marshall Plan was really effective in its time, but also under completely different situations. It had different requirements in it that involved the rebuilding of the countries by the people themselves and not necessarily by American contractors. It also involved repayment options and that type of stuff, and we really haven't been doing that now. We've been focusing too much on just throwing money at countries rather than finding ways to help build the economy in a positive way. So when you say, well, we're gonna use a Marshall Plan to repair this country, that sets the bar really high because everybody knows what that means, and it's not necessarily something we've been able or been very good at following through on.
And as we look on to the other side of the aisle, what has Governor Romney proposed?
We haven't really heard a whole lot coming out of Governor Romney yet. I think he's got some overall good ideas, and we've seen some of that reflected in the GOP platform this year. He's talked a lot about international broadcasting. The Republican Party in general puts a lot of emphasis on that, and I think that's a good thing. However, you also have to realize that we need to reevaluate some of those efforts to see if they're really effective. During the Cold War, and the Republican platform recognizes this, international broadcasting was very effective. But you're also dealing with a lot of closed-off societies that had no access to information. So on that end, there needs to be a little bit of examination in terms of where that's going to go. There's also been more of a focus on internet access and circumvention, which I also think is really good. And one of the programs that the U.S. government has sponsored are programs like Tor, which create a type of circumvention software so that people in countries where their internet access is restricted can actually get around that and get access to the type of information that they need. While I wouldn't recommend focusing entirely on this, this does address some of the issues that we have with closed-off societies today.
And stepping back from the campaigns and the immediate need, what do you think public diplomacy needs in general?
But first and foremost, it needs strategic direction. And like I mentioned before, since the end of the Cold War, we haven't really had that. The war on terror, things like that, they're not really a positive direction that we really want the United States to be going in. So we need to find a way to strengthen our message, reconnect with the values that founded this country, and also try to promote and find ways to enable other people to take those values and make them their own. While they might not necessarily agree with them completely, finding ways for people to have their own voices, to communicate at the same levels that others can, I think is a positive direction for this country to be going, and I think should be one of the major pillars. We also have to reestablish our credibility, and that goes back to what I mentioned about following through. If you're going to state something and say we're going to do it, there needs to be some effort going into doing that, and also making sure that's a goal that we can accomplish in the first place. And we need to build trust relationships. We also need to have success stories for public diplomacy, case examples where we can say, this actually works to accomplish what we're going to do. And that'll go into solving some of the structural issues and some of the budgetary issues we've had within the public diplomacy field.
Matthew Wallin, thank you very much.
Thank you.